Today we're going to cover an operating system called Linux. All right, now anybody in the audience who's listening to this actual computer historian will probably become very upset with me for truncating and butchering the history of Linux so much. But this is the fundamentals you need to understand just to be able to operate as a technology professional and know some of the history and what this thing Linux is. We go back to about 40 years ago when an operating system called Unix was developed. And this operating system was developed for Bell Labs. Way back in the day, before all these modern cell phones and mobile phones and all the different telephone companies existed, there was really only one telephone company in America. It was Bell, was the name of the company, Bell Telephone. We called them Ma Bell, and they basically had a monopoly on all telephone service nationwide. They got broken up in the early 80s, and you have now hundreds of different small and large telecommunications or telephone companies. But back in the day, Bell Telephone, they were the big daddies. They had a research and development arm called Bell Labs. And one of the things that came out of Bell Labs, and there were a lot of technology advances that came out of Bell Labs, one of them was this operating system called Unix. If you recall, an operating system is one of those basic programs that has to get installed onto a computer really to make it useful at all. And it handles really important basics common to any computer you're going to use, like organizing different files that are on the system and allowing access to the files in that system, handling the scheduling of different tasks, handling communication with the various input-output devices that you can connect up to the computer. You need an operating system to handle all those things. And one of the most important things an operating system lets you do is it lets you install other computer programs onto that machine. So get that. The operating system is a computer program you install on a computer that, among other things, lets you install further computer programs. An example, of course, is Windows. Windows is an operating system, and it will let you install, among many other programs, Microsoft Word. So, computer, the operating system on top of it, which is a computer program, and the installation of further computer programs. So, there's a basic review of operating systems. I'm sure at this point you're relatively familiar with that. Unix was built around a paradigm for organized computers and the equipment used in computers that's called client server. And you've probably seen something like this before in your training. Client server has to do with the fact that there's one large computer, we'll call this the server, and there are many external computers that can issue requests for data or work from that server and get the data or the results of that work back from the server. That's a basic concept in computer networks. Unix as an operating system was organized around this sort of an arrangement. And because of that, there are a few things that are sort of built into how Unix works, the way that the people that created it think. And those involve, for example, multitasking. You have user 1, user 2, user 3, and user 4. You want an operating system on the server that's capable of handling simultaneous actions that are going on. So Unix is built around this concept of multiple users and multiple concurrent tasks being executed. Some of the work that contributed to Unix was done by people who worked at Berkeley. That's University of California at Berkeley, long a really strong contributor to the technology industry. When the folks at Bell Labs started selling Unix, it's a for-profit institution after all, and making decisions about how that product, Unix, was going to be marketed and used in the world, some of the folks at Berkeley that really disagreed with that decided they would make their own, and they made an open source version of the operating system. Now, this is a really critical development in technology, an open source operating system. Prior to this, most operating systems had been proprietary. They were created by certain large technology companies, and usually they were intended for use on the equipment, the computers that came from that company. Lots of resources, time, money, and such went into them, and they expected a pretty penny for them. They might build it into the cost of the machine, but they got paid for making that operating system. What the folks at Berkeley did is they released an open source version of that, i.e. the actual computer code that made up the operating system was available for people to just grab and use for free, and more importantly, to create variations on, based on what that individual software developer or team of software developers deemed important in what they wanted out of an operating system. The name they gave to one of the most popular open source versions of this operating system, they couldn't use Unix because it wasn't really Unix. They came up with a name for this operating system called GNU. A GNU, and it's pronounced GNU, the G is silent. A GNU is actually an animal. It's a beast. But the point is, it's also an example of computer professionals being incredibly creative nerds, because what new stands for is new, not Unix. It's not Unix. It's a variation on Unix, built off an open source version of Unix, and it's called GNU, which stands for News, Not Unix. They use the name of it inside the name of it because computer programmers are nerds. It's called a recursive acronym because the acronym itself is inside the definition. It's a bit of a deep dive, but it kind of gives you some insight into the type of people that were doing this kind of work 35, 40 years ago. Hardcore computer nerds. So they could be quite opinionated. And one of the things that came out of that sort of opinionated viewpoint is various different points of view about what an operating system should have. Because of that, there were many different versions of this operating system, because it was open sourced, remember, that came out. We have at present probably 30 or 40 different variations of this operating system that are popular to one degree or another. The most popular family or branch of them is all under this heading of Linux. It's a family of operating systems. People will commonly talk about Linux as an operating system, but it's technically a family of operating systems, all very, very similar, and all based on this historical model of Unix becomes GNU, becomes Linux, and a whole bunch of other flavors of the operating system. Now, this isn't like something you're going to use every day in software development. It's given more by way of background, because if you're going to deal in that Linux world, you're expected to know the history. The history is quite important to that world. Very often you'll find people that work in this part of the technology industry very proud of the fact that they've made a go of it, not supported by the large companies like Microsoft and Google and that sort of thing. They roll their own. They make their own operating systems. They make the decisions, and the responsibility involved in that and the pride in creating a really cool product that gets really popular without a bunch of advertising and money involved means a lot to some of these folks. And I totally understand it. So this is historical background on what Linux is. So all that's in the past. What you need to know now is Linux, as a family of operating systems, is an incredibly popular operating system. And you'll find it in use more than any other operating system in the world.